SRA 211, Session 3.5.2, the G-8 process. In this session, we'll take a closer look at the G-8 and particularly its relevance to counterterrorism. So what is the G-8? First of all, as you probably know, in the real world, it's now the G7, or it's called the G7. Russia, which had been a member for some years, a relative latecomer to the process, was suspended in 2014 over its actions in Crimea and Ukraine. In our simulation, however, we will refer to the G8 because Russia, in our pretend world in this course, will be still participating. So what is the G7 or G8 for us? Since 1975, the heads of state or government of a bunch of very big economies in the world have been meeting annually to consider, discuss, make suggestions about major economic and political or societal issues that really face the entire world. Now, while these issues have traditionally been macroeconomic management, trade, relations with developing countries, North-South dialogue, things like that. There have also been questions of East-West economic relations, energy generally, and terrorism and counterterrorism, as well as other threats that are considered global threats. In fact, the G8 agenda has expanded to include a number of microeconomic issues, employment, digital technology, the environment, crime and drugs, and a host of political security issues that span the spectrum from human rights through arms control. And as stated, counterterrorism is one of these, or the problem of terrorism and counterterrorism measures are one of these topics that are discussed by the G8 leaders. To review the membership, in our G8 world, it's going to be United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Canada, and Russia. Russia, as stated, was a latecomer. The group started in 1975. There were a few additions. Russia was added in 1998 and removed in 2014. Now, throughout the year, the personal representatives of the leaders who are going to meet, they're called Sherpas. They meet regularly to discuss the agenda and monitor progress leading up to each year's summit meeting. So the leaders of this group meet at least once a year in something called the summit. For those of you who are familiar with mountaineering terms, that's the reason why the working level officials who prepare work for the summit are called Sherpas. In the world of mountaineering, Sherpa is a term for, above all, the Nepalese guides that take you to the summit of mountains in the Himalayas. For SRA 211, we don't need to spend too much time on looking at the number of meetings and the type of meetings that are held in this process, but this gives you sort of a schematic view. There is one annual meeting of all the leaders. These are the leaders, presidents, prime ministers, and so on. There are also, sort of in a drop-down menu, there are meetings of ministers. These would be, in the United States, the cabinet-level ministers, sort of the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Attorney General. As you can see here, there are various meetings of the ministers of these countries. They're foreign affairs ministers, they're finance or treasury ministers. There's another group called Justice and Home Affairs. These basically are the government officials who are responsible for dealing with law enforcement issues, counterterrorism, and so on. These are the folks who are of most interest to us. In the United States, it is usually the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and the Attorney General and possibly the FBI Director who attend on the part of the United States, as well as other officials as needed. There also can be other, as an ad hoc basis, meeting of ministers or experts on issues like developmental assistance, energy, environment, or terrorism. So let's take a closer look at the minister meetings that are of interest to us, the meetings of the Justice and Home Affairs ministers. These happen usually once a year, possibly more. This is a forum where the G8 ministers that are responsible for justice and so-called home affairs, including the EU Commissioner for Justice, Secretary General of the International Criminal Police Organization, they're often included as observers. They're able to meet and discuss matters of common interests. Now, in most countries, the representation is by something called the Interior Minister. In much of the world, the Ministry of the Interior is the part of a country's government that deals with police, justice, counterterrorism, things like that. Of course, in the United States, the Department of Interior gets involved with things like national parks. It's a completely different type of concept. Therefore, as stated, we are usually represented by the Attorney General and the Homeland Security Secretary. The main themes of these meetings of Justice and Home Affairs are a wide-ranging discussion of basically the topics of SRA 211, crime and terrorism, in all of its aspects. Now, of course, these ministers are still very senior government officials. There's also a lower level or working level body of officials who get involved in law enforcement and counterterrorism. This is called the Roma-Lyon Group, named for two cities which had been the home of two groups that had joined together. The Rome Group, or Roma, had been set up in 1978 to foster intelligence and security cooperation among the G8 countries, and the Lyon Group, which was established in 1996, was dedicated to cooperation for transnational crime. As you could see here in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, these two groups that are named for the cities in which they first met merged together and became the so-called Roma-Lyon Group. And this combined forum was now charged with, among other things, developing and implementing recommendations to combat terrorism. As you can see here, the work of the Roma-Lyon Group quickly extended to developing various cooperative intelligence and law enforcement arrangements, and to develop sort of best practices in combating terrorism that could be shared with other countries. Today, the Roma-Lyon Group has grown really into the implementing body for all types of counterterrorism initiatives agreed to by the leaders or the Justice and Home Affairs ministers. For that reason, in the context of our simulation exercise, you will be playing as members of the Roma-Lyon Group of the various countries. In the real world, the Roma-Lyon Group is comprised of approximately 300 experts from a number of ministries of the various countries. Interior Ministry, Justice Ministry, Foreign Affairs Ministries, and others, as well as Police and Intelligence Service. The group meets at least 3 times a year, in addition to providing staff support to the annual summit of the leaders and also the periodic meetings of the Justice and Home Affairs ministers. So there's 300 of them in the real world. They will be comprised of you, the SRA 211 class, in our SRA 211 world.